2 cooks, 1 kitchen. Chapter 1. The silence that moved in. The morning after Lily left for Durham University, Martin Fletcher made a pot of coffee for 2, and promptly forgot that 2 was now, mathematically speaking, a generous overestimate. He stood at the kitchen counter in his dressing gown, staring at the second mug as though it had personally insulted him, and tried to remember the last time he had spoken to his wife before 9 in the morning, about something other than whose turn it was to collect Lily from netball practice. Carol Fletcher was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reading the news, with the focused intensity of a woman who had just remembered she was allowed to have thoughts unrelated to school-packed lunches. She had already showered, dressed, and applied lipstick. A level of morning ambition Martin hadn't witnessed since their second anniversary. "Coffee?" he offered. She said. Martin poured the second mug and slid it across the table. It knocked against Carol's elbow. She moved it without looking up. He sat down across from her. They sat in silence. The silence was not hostile. It was not comfortable either. It was the specific silence of 2 people, who had spent 23 years communicating entirely through the buffer of a third person. "Ask your father. Tell your mother. Did Lily say anything to you about?" And were now faced with the unnerving reality that the buffer had gone off to study biochemistry, and would only be home at Christmas. Martin cleared his throat. "So," he said. Carol looked up. "So. Big day. Is it?" He considered this. "I suppose not, actually." They both looked at their coffee. Martin tried to remember what they used to talk about. Before Lily. Before Jack, who was already 3 years into an engineering degree in Edinburgh, and had gone so native he now said "we" without irony. There must have been conversations. Real ones. He and Carol had been married for 6 years before Jack arrived, and he could not, under current conditions, reconstruct a single topic from that period with any confidence. "How's work?" he tried. Carol blinked at him. "Martin. You know how my work is. You ask me every Sunday." "Right. Yes." He nodded. "Good?" "Fine. Good." She returned to her laptop. He drank his coffee. Outside, a wood pigeon made its usual self-important noise in the oak tree, and a car alarm 3 streets away gave 2 apologetic beeps and fell silent. Martin Fletcher was 54 years old. He had a good job in insurance that he described, when pressed, as not terrible. He had a house with a garden he enjoyed in a vague, aspirational way. He had a wife he loved deeply, but could not, at this precise moment, identify a single new thing to say to. This, he thought, was a problem. The problem became more apparent over the following fortnight. They moved around each other in the house with the careful politeness of people sharing a holiday rental with strangers. Carol started watching a Danish crime series in the evenings. Martin began reading books he'd been putting off since the early 2000s. They ate dinner together every night. Carol was very firm about dinner together. But the conversations had the quality of someone reading aloud from a form. "How was your day?" "Fine. How was yours?" "Fine." "Did you call the plumber?" "Not yet." "Shall I?" "You can if you like." One Thursday evening, Martin was attempting to recreate a recipe he'd seen on television. A pasta dish that had seemed straightforward on screen, and was currently behaving like a culinary hostage situation on his hob. When Carol came into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and stood watching him with the mild scientific interest of someone observing an animal in a zoo. "What is that?" she said. "Cacio e pepe," he said, with slightly more confidence than was warranted. Carol tilted her head. The pasta had fused into a single alarming lump. The sauce, which was meant to be silky and emulsified, was doing something that could only be described as splitting with purpose. "It's not supposed to look like that," she said. "I'm aware." She took a sip of wine. "I could fix it." "I don't need it fixed, I need." He stopped. Tried the pasta with a fork. Made a face. "Fine. Fix it." Carol set down her glass, rolled up her sleeves, and within 4 minutes, had transformed the disaster into something that smelled extraordinary. Martin watched her work. The quick confident movements, the way she seasoned without measuring, the small satisfied sound she made when the sauce came together. And felt, with some surprise, that he had not looked at her this carefully in quite some time. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. She looked up. "I've been cooking for 23 years, Martin." "I know, but..." He gestured at the pan. "That specifically." She smiled, just a little. "YouTube. About 6 months ago." "You've been secretly learning to cook from YouTube?" "I've been quietly improving," she said, with great dignity. "There's a difference." Martin ate his fixed pasta and thought about this. About what else he might not know about his own wife. About what she might not know about him. Though in fairness, he had been fairly consistent, and not terribly surprising for the better part of 2 decades. He thought about the YouTube cooking. About the fact that she had wanted to get better at something, had gone quietly about getting better at it, and had not mentioned it to him. Not because she was hiding it. Simply because they had stopped being the first person each other thought to tell things to. That, he decided, needed fixing. Though he had absolutely no idea how to go about it. Chapter 2. The business plan. First draft, terrible. The idea, in retrospect, could be traced directly to Martin's brother Keith. Keith was 51, perpetually enthusiastic about opportunities, and had, over the course of their adult lives, been briefly involved in a van hire company, a subscription box for gardening tools, a pop-up restaurant that lasted 11 days, and something involving essential oils that none of the family liked to discuss at Christmas. He was also, despite all evidence to the contrary, a man who inspired a certain unguarded hopefulness in other people. Which was why Martin met him for a pint one Friday, and walked out 2 hours later convinced he needed to start a business. "It's brilliant," Keith had said, gesturing with his beer in a way that suggested he had not yet fully thought this through. "You've got time, you've got savings, Lily's off your hands. She's at university, not off my hands. Carol's been wanting to do something different for ages," she told Sandra at that barbecue. "And you've always said you wanted more." Keith paused. "More what? What have you always said you wanted more of?" "I don't know. Purpose, maybe." Keith pointed at him. "Purpose. Start something together. People love that. Couples who build things together, stay together." He nodded with the gravity of a man who had read this on a motivational poster. "Look at those people on that baking program. They're competitors, Keith. They're competing against each other." "Right, but they're still together at the end of the episode. Mostly. Sometimes they cry. That's intimacy." Martin had gone home and said nothing about this to Carol. Then he'd thought about it for a week. Then he'd made a list. The list was titled, "Things we are both good at. Could do together." Tentative, subject to Carol's input, which has not yet been solicited. The list had 3 items on it. 1. Cooking. Carol, definitely. Martin, increasingly. 2. Organizing things. Both, in different ways that sometimes conflict. 3. Making people feel at home. Carol. Martin. To be confirmed. He had stared at this list for some time and then, with the particular energy of a man who has watched one too many small business documentaries. Written underneath it: private dining? Supper club? Catering? He'd shown it to Carol on a Saturday morning over breakfast, sliding it across the table with the casual air of someone pretending they hadn't spent 3 evenings on this. Carol had picked it up. Read it. Turned it over to check the back. Turned it back. A supper club, she said. Or catering. For small events. Or both. She looked at him over the paper. Martin. Just a thought. You've numbered it. I like numbered lists. She set it down. Pulled it back. Read it again. Her expression was doing something he couldn't quite interpret. A sequence of small movements that passed through skeptical and amused, and landed somewhere in the vicinity of genuinely considering this. When did you start thinking about this? She asked. Recently. A pause. About 2 weeks ago. And you're just showing me now? I was workshopping it. By yourself? Well, you were watching the Danish thing. She looked at him levelly. Martin, I have been watching that series for 11 days. You could have said something 11 days ago. I wanted it to be developed enough to be worth saying. Carol sat back in her chair. She was quiet for a moment. The thoughtful kind of quiet, not the polite kind. What would we actually make? She said. And that, it turned out, was the beginning of everything. They spent that Saturday at the kitchen table with 2 laptops, 3 cookbooks, and a notepad each, talking more than they had talked in months. The conversation moved fast and then slow, veered off into a 20-minute digression about whether fennel was broadly liked or a divisive herb. Martin. Divisive. Carol. You're thinking of licorice. Circled back, got practical, got excited. Got into a genuine disagreement about pricing that neither of them resolved, but both of them enjoyed. By Sunday evening they had a concept. A small supper club, run from their house, 6 to 10 guests, 1 evening a fortnight. No menus given in advance. Seasonal British produce with influences from wherever took their fancy that week. Wine pairings optional but encouraged. The name was still under debate. Martin had suggested the Fletcher table, which Carol described as something a furniture shop would print on a tote bag. But everything else was beginning to feel real. It was the most fun Martin had had in years. He did not say this aloud, because he was English and it would have been strange. But he was fairly certain Carol knew. Chapter 3. First night, all disasters welcome. The inaugural evening of what was now officially called 14 Elms Suppers. Named for the road, because neither of them could agree on anything more evocative. And the printer needed the name by Thursday. Was scheduled for the second Saturday in October. And was, by any reasonable measure, a logistical adventure. They had invited 8 people. 2 couples they knew well. 1 couple Carol knew through her book club. And a pair of Martin's former colleagues from the insurance firm, who had expressed enthusiasm in the way that people sometimes do, when they expect to be uninvited before the event actually arrives. They had not been uninvited. They arrived at 7:15, slightly surprised. The menu had gone through 4 revisions. The final version was smoked mackerel pâté with sourdough, slow-roasted lamb shoulder with heritage carrots and a sauce that Martin had spent 2 days calibrating, a cheese board of frankly unnecessary ambition, and Carol's chocolate tart, which was the only dish that had never once caused either of them any concern. The problem was that they had designed the menu collaboratively, but had not. And this was the fundamental issue. Agreed on who was in charge in the kitchen. I need the oven, Martin said at 6:45, opening the oven door to check on the lamb. I know you need the oven, I'm finishing the tarts. The tarts should be done by now. The tarts need another 8 minutes. The lamb has been resting since 6:15, Carol, it needs to go back in. It does not need to go back in, you've been resting it perfectly adequately, Martin, just wait 8 minutes. I'm not waiting 8 minutes. He waited 8 minutes. He filled the time by arranging the sourdough on a board with slightly excessive precision, and being told by Carol that the bread didn't need to be sculpted. She did not say this unkindly. It was more in the register of someone gently explaining that a problem exists. The guests arrived. The house, which Carol had spent Wednesday and Thursday transforming, with candles and a tablecloth they'd received as a wedding gift and never used, looked extraordinary. Martin had done the wine, which was the one area of the evening where they had divided responsibilities cleanly and without incident. The first hour was, unexpectedly, marvelous. The mackerel pâté went out looking beautiful and came back as empty dishes. Their friends settled quickly into the warmth of the room, the wine did its work, and Martin, who had not expected to enjoy the front of house role as much as he did, found himself genuinely charmed by the process of feeding people he liked in his own home. And then Carol brought out the lamb. It was perfect. That was not the problem. The problem was that Martin had already told 2 separate guests that the lamb was his dish, and Carol had, from the kitchen doorway, overheard this claim, and was now conveying her feelings about it through the specific medium of how she set down the serving spoon. He means, Carol said, smiling with absolute serenity, that it's our dish. Of course. Martin said. Our dish. He made the sauce. Carol said. I made the lamb itself. There's a distinction. The sauce is part of the lamb. The lamb is not the sauce. Their guests looked between them with the delighted attention of people watching a tennis match. They're adorable, said Carol's friend from book club, whose name was Philippa, and who had clearly not expected the evening to include entertainment of this caliber. We're not adorable, Martin said. We might be slightly adorable, Carol conceded. The lamb was eaten. The argument about the lamb, who had sourced it? Martin. Who had seasoned it? Carol. Whose idea the herb crust was? Both, simultaneously, which had itself become a small argument. Continued in the kitchen while they plated the cheese course, at lowered volume, while their guests talked happily in the dining room. This is fun, Carol said, at one point, into the middle of the lamb debate. Martin stopped. What? This? She gestured at the kitchen. The beautiful disorder of it. The empty serving dishes. The half-drunk glasses they'd brought in from the table. All of this. It's genuinely fun. He looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed from the cooking, from the wine, from the small electric current of an argument that wasn't really an argument. She looked like herself. Or like someone he'd been meaning to get back to knowing better. Yes, he said. It is. They brought out the cheese. Martin told the story of sourcing the aged cheddar from a farm in Somerset, which was true but also slightly embellished for narrative effect. Carol caught his eye from across the table and did not quite smile, but her expression said something that had previously gone unsaid. The evening ended at 11:30. Their guests left saying, with varying degrees of sobriety, that they absolutely had to come back, and could they bring friends next time? And was the sauce recipe available? And when was the next one? When the door closed on the last of them, Martin and Carol stood in the hallway for a moment in the sudden quiet. Well, he said. Well, she said. They went back into the kitchen and, without discussing it, both began to wash up. Chapter 4. The Spreadsheet War and Other Intimacies. By December, they had run 5 suppers, filled every available date, and started a waiting list that Carol managed in a spreadsheet, and Martin managed in a competing spreadsheet. the existence of which Carol discovered on a Tuesday morning, and regarded as a declaration of war. "Why?" she said, with the patience of someone approaching a complicated diplomatic situation. "Do you have your own spreadsheet? Because yours doesn't have a column for dietary requirements. Mine has a notes column. A notes column is not the same as a dietary requirements column." "Martin. It functions identically." "It does not function identically, it just." He took a breath. "Can I show you something?" "No. It will take 30 seconds. I don't want to see your spreadsheet." "You haven't seen it yet." "I don't need to see it to know I don't want to." He showed her the spreadsheet. She looked at it for a long time. "You've color-coded it," she said. "By dietary category. Green is dairy-free and vegetarian. The lighter green is vegan." She was quiet for a moment. "That's quite clever. Thank you. I'm still not merging them." They merged them by Thursday. The combined spreadsheet was, both of them privately agreed, significantly better than either individual version, though neither said this aloud. This was, it turned out, the shape of most of their disagreements. Fierce, specific, and resolved by Thursday. They argued about table settings. Martin wanted a cleaner look. Carol said minimalist just meant they'd forgotten something. About whether to charge more per head. Carol, yes. Martin worried it would change the feel of it. About whether to do a Christmas special in December. Both. Yes. And whether to theme it. Carol. Tastefully. Martin. Fully. Resulting in a compromise where the menu had a festive theme, but Martin was not, under any circumstances, allowed to wear the Santa hat he had purchased with what Carol could only describe as alarming enthusiasm. The Christmas supper had 12 guests, and was, by some distance, the most enjoyable evening either of them could remember in a very long time. Martin had done a mulled wine reduction with the beef that he was genuinely proud of. Carol had made a chestnut and mushroom starter that Philippa from the book club described as transcendent, which Carol mentioned only once, but in a tone suggesting she would be dining on it for some time. Lily came home for Christmas the following week and found her parents in the kitchen together, arguing about whether the supper club should have a social media presence, and felt the particular comfort of realizing that something she hadn't known was wrong, had evidently been quietly fixed. "You two seem different," she said, over dinner on the second evening. "Different how?" Carol asked. Lily considered it. "Louder?" She tried. "Like, you're talking more." "We've always talked," Martin said. Lily gave him the look of a 20-year-old, who has spent her whole life quietly observing the adults around her, and has very specific opinions. "Dad," she said kindly. "You used to just agree with each other. That's talking." "That's not talking, that's just waiting." There was a pause. "She's right," Carol said. "She's our child," Martin said. "She can't be right about us, it's..." He stopped. "She's right." Lily ate her dinner with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had, in a single sentence, accidentally summarized a marriage. It was also in December that Martin, without discussing it with Carol, contacted his niece's friend who did graphic design, and commissioned a logo. He presented it to Carol one evening after supper. A simple, elegant illustration of a table laid for dinner, with 14 elm suppers in a clean serif beneath it. Carol held it for a long time. "You did this without asking me," she said. "I did. I would have wanted input on the font." "I know." She looked up at him. "It's perfect, Martin." He felt the specific satisfaction of having, for once, surprised her. Not with flowers or a card. He was good at those, had been performing those gestures faithfully for 23 years. but with something that showed he had been paying attention to what she was building. "I've been paying attention," he said, in case that wasn't clear. She gave him a look that was more complicated and more warm than he could fully read, which meant, he thought, that it was probably something worth the wait. Chapter 5. Fully booked, mostly happy. By March, they had a proper system. Carol handled bookings, communications, dietary requirements, and the table settings, which she arranged with the focused creativity of someone who had spent 20 years organizing other people's logistics, and was now, finally, doing it for something she cared about. Martin handled the wine, the sourcing of ingredients, which had turned into a small Saturday morning ritual of visiting the farmer's market, during which they had accidentally acquired strong opinions about heritage tomatoes, and what he referred to as the ambient production values, which Carol had translated, generously, as the music and the lighting. The cooking they did together, which remained chaotic, and which they had both stopped trying to fully resolve, because the chaos, it turned out, was part of what made it work. They had developed a kitchen shorthand. Carol's raised eyebrow meaning "you've overseasoned that." Martin's particular way of standing next to the hob meaning "I'm nervous about this sauce. Please advise without saying I told you so." That required no words at all. This was different from the polite silence of the previous year. This was a silence that had content. They were written up in a local food blog in February, which brought 47 inquiries in a single week. The waiting list grew to 3 months. Martin took to reading the blog post aloud in moments of quiet self-satisfaction, until Carol told him, with great affection, to stop. Jack came home at Easter, and spent an afternoon helping with prep for a dinner that weekend. Mostly because he'd eaten the smoked mackerel pâté and couldn't leave without the recipe. And reported back to Lily, in a sibling debrief that neither parent was supposed to know about, that Mum and Dad were, weirdly back to normal but better, which Lily agreed was accurate, though neither of them could have defined what normal meant in this context. There was a supper in late March where everything went wrong in sequence. The sourdough didn't rise, the wine merchant sent the wrong cases, and Martin, attempting to fix the bread situation with a last-minute shop run, returned with the wrong flour and a very apologetic expression. They had 8 guests arriving in 2 hours. "Right," Carol said, standing in the kitchen with a towel over her shoulder, and the calm face of someone who has triaged emergencies before, and knows what that looks like. "Crackers from the deli instead of sourdough. We have the mackerel, it works just as well. The wine. What did they send?" "Mostly whites." "We're doing lamb." "I know we're doing lamb." "Fine. We'll make it work. White with the starter, I'll call Derek about the reds." She was already on her phone. Martin stood and watched her, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite love, but was a variety of both that you only get when you've been watching someone be capable for 23 years and are still, genuinely, impressed. Derek came through with the reds. The crackers worked better than the sourdough, which both of them decided to feel superior about. The guests never knew anything had been wrong. Afterwards, Carol sat at the kitchen table with her shoes off and a glass of the white, which had been excellent, as it turned out. And Martin sat across from her, and they had a conversation that wandered comfortably for an hour, through the evening just past, through what they do differently, through a plan Martin had for a spring menu involving a pea and mint element that Carol was cautiously endorsing, through whether they should try to take on a second evening per month. Carol: "Yes." Martin: "Let's see." And through a memory that surfaced when Carol mentioned a restaurant they'd eaten at once in their early 30s. A small place in Lisbon, the summer before Jack was born. And Martin said he'd never forgotten the salt cod they'd had there. And Carol said she'd never forgotten the evening itself. And they were both quiet for a moment, with the particular warmth of a memory you've held separately for decades, and have only just, finally, looked at together. "We should go back," Martin said. To Lisbon? We've never been back. Carol tilted her head, the way she did when she was thinking. We haven't, have we? We could go. Not for research. He added quickly. Just to go. She smiled at him. The full one, not the polite one. We could do that. It was a small thing, as future plans went. Two middle-aged people at a kitchen table, talking about a trip they might take to a city they'd visited once before they had children. In a life that had been, by almost any measure, a good one. But that had recently become something more specifically, consciously, theirs. 14 Elms Suppers had a full calendar through June. The waiting list was now 4 months. They had talked, in a preliminary and unserious way, about what it might look like to do this properly. As a real, registered, actual business, rather than something that happened in their dining room every other Saturday while the house still smelled like lamb. They had not decided anything yet. But they were talking about it. In the kitchen, late on a Saturday, with the dishes done and the candles burned down and the table cleared, they were talking about it. Interrupting each other, disagreeing about the logistics, finding their way back to the thing they both wanted, through the enjoyable friction of being two people who think differently, and have decided, with full information and some experience, to keep thinking together. This was, as it turned out, a fairly good definition of a marriage. They had just needed 23 years, 2 grown children, a half-failed pasta dish, and a color-coded spreadsheet to remember it.